Hi, we're back talking about the romantic characteristics. This time we're talking about the characteristic of exoticism. Exoticism is an interest in faraway places or times. So you have to kind of remember people didn't actually move around that much during this time period. Travel was still pretty rare. And so artists, they would hear about faraway places and they would say, wow, that sounds so cool. And then they would paint about it. Sometimes what they heard was not accurate, was not correct. And unfortunately, what starts to happen is the public at large is going to see these paintings and start to believe these things. So one example of this happening is with this idea of a harem, and you see a harem pictured in this painting. The idea of a harem to Western audiences was the idea that in some Islamic cultures, in the North Africa or in Middle East, men would practice polygamy, meaning that they would have sexual access to more than one woman. So this idea to Westerners was fascinating. They thought, wow, this is such a fantasy. I've always wanted to have a bunch of women that I could have sex with. And so they would paint a lot of paintings, including this idea of a harem. However, this conception that they had was not accurate. A harem is a place inside an Islamic house where women can go unveiled. It's a place where they're protected so that men wouldn't walk in if, for example, some work had to be done in the house. The workmen wouldn't be able to get to that section of the house, so the women would be protected. They wouldn't have to wear their covering, their veil. If the husband had business acquaintances coming over, they wouldn't have access to that part of the house. So it was really a way to practice this religion, a way to practice the Islamic religion where women would be covered in front of men that were not their husband. And it was a way to protect them so that they could hang out without having their covering on. The women that lived in the harem, they would be, one would be the man's wife. Islamic cultures in North Africa and the Middle East did not practice polygamy. In fact, they frowned on it, meaning that they thought it was immoral. And the other women would be daughters, maybe an aunt, the wife's sister, maybe a grandmother. And this is pretty common. A lot of people live together with other members of their family. So this is the reality, was that this is really just a part of the home. Women would live together. They were not all the man's wives. But when the Europeans heard about this idea, they took it, they misunderstood it, and then they made a bunch of paintings about it, which caused more and more people to see these paintings and also believe this misunderstanding. And so we see a lot of them and in this Romantic period, because people are dreaming. Remember, they're fantasizing. They are having those rose-colored glasses on. They're not really concerned with reality. They just want to dream about these faraway places. So this is a painting. It's by Eugene Delacroix, the same guy that did Liberty Leading the People. And this one is called The Death of Sardanapalus. Sardanapalus is pictured here. Sardanapalus was an ancient Assyrian king. Assyria is modern-day Iraq, but even at the time that Sardanapalus painted this, which was 1827, Assyria was no longer an empire. So this is like the ancient Romans or the ancient Greeks. Delacroix chose to tell this story of Sardanapalus because he had a little bit of a message, so there's a little bit of a social protest involved in this one too. The story is that this king, Sardanapalus, he had faced invaders and his army failed. So the last of his guard, the last of his army came to him and said, we're going to lose. We can't stop them. They're marching to the palace. So what Sardanapalus says is that instead of allowing these foreign invaders to take pleasure in any of his belongings, he commands his guard to kill all of the women in his harem, which of course isn't a real thing, but our artist is depicting it like it is, to kill the horses, to bring all of his treasures together, they'll be set on fire, so that way when the intruders come, there will be nothing left for them to take. Sardanapalus in the end plans to kill himself. So this scene is very violent, it's very emotional. This is a huge painting. You can see the women here, they're nude, so they're showing that fantasy. They're struggling. The guardsmen are killing them. This was the woman that was in love, one of Sardanapalus' harem, who was in love with him, and she is already dead here on the bed in front of him. The guard here is stabbing this woman. The guard here is stabbing the horse. You have all these piles of cloth and jewels and fabrics. So the scene is very emotional. The scene seems pretty unfair. When you look at Sardanapalus, he's very cool. He's watching all these things that he loves be destroyed, and he's not really showing a whole lot of emotion. And the message here, the social protest, is that kings don't care about the people. What Delacroix was saying here was that this is just 3 years before Liberty leading the people in that revolution that would get rid of the king they didn't like and install Louis Philippe. What Delacroix is saying is that kings have always been bad. Even back in the days of Sardanapalus, kings were bad and didn't care about the people. Kings today are still bad and don't care about the people. The reason why this is exotic is that there's lots of references to faraway places. So the number one thing is this reference to a harem, which of course we know is not true, but it was a very popular subject matter in Romantic paintings. But look around, there's lots of things. Look at the way they're dressed, the men wearing these head coverings. This is exotic. Look at the beating on the horse's rein. This is exotic. There's like a tapestry on the saddle. The bed has elephant heads on the corners. Elephants are from a faraway place. So all of these things would have been really interesting to the people of France, who wouldn't actually be able to travel to these places themselves, but would want to see aspects of those cultures represented in the paintings. Again, there's a link to this one in the PowerPoint, so you can watch the video about it as well if you have any questions. We're going to move on to our next characteristic, which is the demonic and grotesque. The demonic or grotesque is anything that has to do with the dark side of life: blood, death, murder, the devil, ghosts, things of that nature are demonic and grotesque. Very famous examples from this time period are Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So Frankenstein is the doctor. He reanimates a dead body. He brings a dead body back to life. The monster is completely left alone. The doctor abandons him, and so he ends up killing people because he has this superhuman strength that he doesn't know what to do with. And so this is an example of the demonic and the grotesque. A dead body coming back to life is demonic. Edgar Allan Poe is another example. Edgar Allan Poe is an American writer, was an American writer. He had a troubled life, and we see aspects of that in his short stories and poems. They almost all have this demonic or grotesque quality. They're either about murder or death or longing for lost love or ghosts. And we can see that in the poem The Raven. Again, in the PowerPoint, if you click this link, it'll open the poem for you. The Raven is about this man who is sitting alone in his house, and he hears a tapping at the door, and he opens it, and this black bird comes in. The raven is, of course, a symbol of death. It's somewhat of a supernatural feeling in the poem. The idea that this messenger of death is bringing this man news of his lost love, Lenore. It was written just 2 years before Edgar Allan Poe lost his own wife, Virginia. So it's one of those time periods in history where art actually predicts what happens in someone's life. I also included this link. It's the Simpsons version of the poem. A few years ago at Halloween, the Simpsons acted out this poem, The Raven, and so it might be easier for you to watch this to experience the poem. I highly recommend Edgar Allan Poe. I really love his poetry and short stories. Some of them are a little gross, but very intriguing stories. There are paintings that represent the demonic and grotesque as well. This one is by an artist called Francisco Goya. Francisco Goya hated Napoleon, and much of his work has this message of his hatred of Napoleon in it. So this painting, Executions of the 3rd of May, 1808, it is actually depicting a real-life event. In Spain, there's a good reason why Goya hated Napoleon. In Spain, Napoleon talked to the Spanish king, and he said, "Can I march through Spain so I can get to Portugal? I want to invade Portugal." And the Spanish king says, "Okay, sure." But Napoleon did this as a trick, and he actually ends up invading Spain, taking over the Spanish throne, installing his brother on the throne. And so the Spanish people say, "Hey, we don't want this intruder king in our country." And some of the Spanish citizens, they try to fight back. And these are not necessarily the trained army, but just individual citizens. When Napoleon hears about this, he's so enraged. He says, "How dare these private citizens think that they could challenge my mighty army?" And so he orders reprisal killings. Reprisal killings are payback. And that's what's happening in this scene. You can see in the background this small town. The buildings here show this small town. And one night, May 3rd, 1808, Napoleon's men, these are Napoleon's soldiers, they pulled all the men of the town out. So this is a long line of the men going all the way back to the background. And they executed them one by one. So Goya is giving us some messages here. He says, these men are innocent. See how this man is wearing white? He's in this gesture that is almost Christ-like, almost like a vision of Christ on the cross. He looks terrified. They look hopeless. They are afraid. They're covering their eyes. They just can't believe it. And so he says, the Spanish people, these good people, they did not deserve this reprisal, this repayment. He doesn't seem to be blaming Napoleon's men. Napoleon's men here are faceless. They all are kind of similar. They're making the same movement with their bodies. They're dressed the same way because they're soldiers. And so in a way, he's kind of showing it's not their fault. They were just carrying out their orders. They were just soldiering on. It's really Napoleon that he's mad at, and he is expressing his frustration here in this painting. It's demonic and grotesque because you could see this puddle of blood in the foreground. This gentleman, if you look closely, you could see that he's been shot in the forehead. You can see little pieces of his skull chipped away and his brain matter exposed. So this is demonic and grotesque. This is another one by Goya. It is also demonic and grotesque. It's this story of Saturn devouring one of his children. So Saturn is the Roman version of Kronos, who was Zeus's father. And if you remember, we talked a little bit about the story of Zeus. The story was that his mother hid him away because Kronos commanded her to bring him all of the babies when they were born so he could swallow them whole in order to protect himself from one of the babies growing up and eventually killing him. There was a prophecy that he had heard. Well, the mom, she got tired of him eating the babies, so she hid one of the babies away. That baby was Zeus. Zeus comes back, kills his father, slices his stomach open, and out pop all of his brothers and sisters. Typically, when we hear this story, we think of this immortal god or this titan god of Kronos or Saturn swallowing the children whole. We very rarely see a depiction like this. This figure back here, he himself looks grotesque. He's got these giant bulging eyes. His mouth is this huge shape. His hair is straggly. His body is sort of misshapen, and the way it's painted, it's all these different colors. So it just kind of looks unusual to us. It's not idealized or pleasant. And then, of course, instead of swallowing the body whole, he has ripped the head off, and he is now devouring the arm. You see the blood there gushing down. So it is demonic and grotesque. It's a gross way, a grotesque way of showing this mythical scene. But there's also that little jab at Napoleon there. The idea is that Goya is showing Saturn here as Napoleon. Napoleon is devouring his people in that he is sending his citizens into these needless wars, right? They didn't have to start this war with Spain, and it's causing all this suffering and death. And so in that way, Napoleon is actually devouring his own people, hurting his own population. Okay, so we're going to move on. Our next characteristic is the femme fatale. The femme fatale is also known as the theme of the fatal woman. The idea that a woman is dangerous because of her charms, that men cannot resist these devilish women. So you're looking here at some depictions of Eve with Adam, right? Here Eve is looking very temptuous, right? She's like, hey, Adam, this apple is delicious. You should eat it. And so the idea of the femme fatale is that this dangerous woman is going to lead this unassuming man to his downfall. And this is an example. It's a poem by Heinrich Heine. It's called The Lorelei. So the name of the poem is The Lorelei. And the poem is about a femme fatale. So I'll read it for you. I know not if there is a reason why I am so sad at heart. A legend of bygone ages haunts me and will not depart. The air is cool under nightfall. The calm Rhine courses its way. The peak of the mountain is sparkling with evening's final ray. The fairest of maidens is sitting, unwittingly wondrous up there. Her golden jewels are shining. She's combing her golden hair. The comb she holds is golden. She sings a song as well, whose melody binds an enthralling and overpowering spell. In his little boat, the boatman is seized with a savage woe. He'd rather look up at the mountain than down at the rocks below. I think that the waves will devour the boatman and boat as one. And this, with her song's sheer power, fair Lorelei has done. So Lorelei is this mythical figure of a siren. And the idea is that this poor boatman, he's just swimming along, or he's just sailing along, doing his thing. And there's this beautiful woman up there singing, and she's so entrancing that he can't look away from her, and he ends up crashing his boat. So it's not his fault, it is this woman's fault. This woman leads him to his downfall. Our last characteristic is nationalism. Nationalism means national pride, and a good example of it can be found in Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. Tchaikovsky is a Russian composer, and the 1812 Overture was actually written after Russia defeated Napoleon's armies. This was a few years before he was defeated at Waterloo and then exiled, but this was the first time Napoleon had been stopped by any of the countries that he was invading. So Tchaikovsky wrote this music to commemorate this battle. It's nationalistic. When you listen to it, you'll hear church choirs singing, you'll hear bells ringing, you'll hear cannons bursting. All of these things inspire national pride. It's Russia saying, hey, we were the underdog and we defeated France in this moment. So click on the link, open the PowerPoint, click on the link so you can listen to Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, and that's it for our romantic characteristics.